Hi guys, thanks for tuning in to another episode of Nuggets News. Today we've got a second returning guest of our new segment, Where Are They Now? We welcome back the guys from Loki. How you going?
Hey, Ed. Very well, thank you. Yourself?
Doing well.
Pretty good, surviving this bear market. But before we dive into it, I want to talk about all the privacy stuff that's going on in Australia. The Assistance and Access Bill, very timely and very relevant to your project. So what do you guys think about what's going on there?
Well, we actually came across this bill maybe 3 months ago. We got in on the consultation process and we wrote some letters and stuff. They wrote back to me and asked me if I wanted my response published somewhere. I don't know what happened to that exactly, but I said yes. So hopefully it was a good one.
It was crazy. They did the consultation period and it only lasted for a week, I think it was.
Yeah, it was super tight.
It was quite clear that they didn't really care about what people thought about the bill.
And they still don't care because the backlash has been huge and both sides of politics have decided, nah, we'll rush it through, even though it will not make the excuse being, oh, we need to get it through for Christmas so things are safer. And yet there's a 28-day consultation period on the TCN anyway, so nothing's going to happen until after New Year's. And then the TCN notification is nothing's actually being built during that time. So any new capabilities, whatever the hell that means, that would be implemented in XYZ software probably wouldn't actually take effect for months anyway. So
for anyone who doesn't know what the TCN is, I think it's called the Technical Capability Notice.
Yeah.
So essentially the bill breaks down into 3 different parts. One of them is a voluntary request to help them gather information. So that would be like if you're a messaging service and you store messages on your server, you have to voluntarily, or you can voluntarily give those to them. The second one is the
it's not even that. It's just like you can voluntarily, if they issue you a request, I think it's called a technical technical assistance request, TAR. Right, it's a TAR. They will try and get you to voluntarily give up certain information about the way the program is designed or possible. The bill's really vague about what it actually requires software companies to do and what constitutes a systemic weakness, which is something that the bill is not allowed to introduce, but it actually goes to absolutely zero length at defining what exactly a systemic weakness is. There's some talk of some amendments that are being suggested in Parliament that systemic weakness would be defined by a council of a retired judge and a technical expert of the field that the particular request addresses. So basically you have a court of opinion of 2 people deciding whether or not the government is allowed to do X, Y, Z, which is a bit scary. And then on top of the voluntary one, there's a TAN, which is a technical assistance notice instead of a request. So that's mandatory. You have to either give them information about how things work, or you have to allow them to install something or collect certain information. Or then there's the TCN, which is the really scary one, which I believe only the Attorney General can sign off on and authorize, which is better than just any old dicky-dido being able to do it. But it's really scary, and one letter from the Attorney General could mean that Facebook has to change its entire capability in order to allow the Australian government to do X, Y, Z. And
it's unclear really how this applies to overseas companies. That's one of the most questionable parts about it, because WhatsApp is not based in Australia. Obviously, they provide services to Australia, but if the government comes along and says, okay, well, we're giving you a TCN and now you have to insert an additional function, which it's not allowed to break encryption. They say that very specifically in the bill, but there's a lot of things you can do that don't break encryption that still provide a huge amount of metadata for you to analyze. So,
I mean, you don't even have to break encryption if you install something on the client side that just after it's been decrypted, just sends the plain text off to whatever.
So for people at home, Facebook and Google have pushed back, and I'm not really sure how Australia can give themselves supremacy over these companies based in other countries. That's interesting to watch that play out. But the big fear for the average Joe watching this at home is as soon as you give someone any sort of backdoor or weakness, that is just going to be the big target for the hackers to go, right, we want to get our hands on whatever the backdoor or weakness is, and then they have information to this encrypted data or metadata, whatever it is.
Yeah, and it's not like, unless you're breaking the encryption itself, it's not like these capability things are going to be any, like they're going to be pretty easy to spot for savvy analysts who are looking at applications and doing packet analysis on them. They'll be able to see that how much data is leaking from the application, whether or not it's supposed to, and what sort of information it is as well. So that could be a big indicator of, okay, so this company has had to install this thing that sends the contents of decrypted messages to somewhere, and they can track that and watch when each part happens and see if it's being sent before or after decryption, or all these sort of things. So I'm not actually certain what they might want companies to do with this. I suspect once it kicks off, they'll realize that there's actually not a lot that they can gain without revealing their hand. So, and that's especially pertinent to Loki as well, because obviously we don't run any of the servers of our communication platforms. It's all decentralized. And if we were to somehow introduce some sort of, I don't know, statistical gathering software into our open source code base, which is audited by a fair few people without being noticed, I'd be A, impressed, or B, I'd be interested to know how much information they could actually glean from that.
The difference with Loki is that we ourselves, we're just open source developers, so we don't actually run any of the infrastructure. That's the service node operators that do that. So you have to convince the service node operators to run your software. So if we published a release on our GitHub and the code was up there, it's very easy to see what's inside of the code and see if someone is putting in a backdoor. The really malicious backdoors, and I'm not really sure whether the government could ask you to do this, is intentionally introducing a bug which could be exploited. And that would be, I think that would be way outside of the scope. And that definitely, in my understanding, would be introducing a systemic weakness.
I don't think that would mean.
Yeah, I feel like the two people that sign off on the change plus the Attorney General would agree that that's a systemic weakness. I think the scariest thing about this is that we have the metadata laws that came out in, I think, 2015. And they said, oh, we're only going to use these in very specific cases. And then last year, it turns out that councils have access to query people's metadata now. And there's 350,000 requests a year for people's metadata. So you can see, like, the scope of the change. Like, they'll introduce this. They'll say it's only to deal with child pornographers and terrorists. And then eventually they apply it to everyone. This is the start of every single change that they've made. Even in the US, they do the same thing. They always do it under just the guise of protecting you against terrorists. And then they lengthen the law to just affect every single person. We know the playbook.
Yeah. So this gets down to the fundamental importance of decentralization, the same as they're trying to blacklist a Bitcoin address. It's like, good luck convincing 10,000 nodes not to, accept transactions or whatever it is. It can't be done with a truly decentralized network, and that's the whole point of Loki, I guess.
Well, I think the interesting part about the Bitcoin stuff is that it might be more possible than you think. And the way that it's possible is because exchanges are centralized points, right? The fiat on-ramps and off-ramps are the points where you can say, okay, if an exchange accepts a Bitcoin address that we've blocked, like the 2 weeks ago, this Russian hacker BTC addresses or whatever that the US, I can't remember, some US council said that you can't accept money from them. I think the exchanges are more likely to actually follow that regulation. especially US exchanges and exchanges that want to deal with US customers. That's why we actually think Loki is pretty important, because they wouldn't be able to do the same thing in Loki. You can't blacklist public addresses. And yeah, I'm very doubtful that this new legislation is going to apply broadly to us, but it is a scary move.
So you guys have already touched on the new service nodes. Rather than proof of work, it's that proof of service, and they get rewarded for processing transactions. But talk about the privacy upgrades. Festive Freya is a pretty cool name. Bulletproofs, similar to Monero and a few other things as well.
Yeah. So the biggest thing, so service nodes got released. It must be 3 or 4 months ago now.
September 1.
Yeah. So service nodes have been up for a while, and they've been working really well. So that's the second layer that we were talking about in our first interview. That's up and that's working. Festive Freya is just kind of like a smaller release before we do our next release. Probably sometime early or mid next year. So the main things that we're adding are bulletproof. So this reduces the size of transactions massively. So the typical transaction size in Loki right now is 13 kilobytes, and this reduces the size to 1 kilobyte.
Yep.
So you're seeing like a huge decrease in the transaction size. This is something that was developed by the guys at the Monero Research Lab. Really cool project, and we're merging that in. And there's a couple of other small things, basically just user experience improvements in the GUI wallet, but nothing too huge. Most of the stuff that we're doing right now is happening on LokiNet. So if you want to jump on LokiNet, we have a private testnet set up in which you can actually access snaps. So we're just starting to develop the earliest part of that. It's not actually launched on top of the service nodes yet. We're just running the private testnet. But in the next couple of months, you'll really be seeing some huge moves on that front. The development has been going really well on LokiNet.
So there'll be applications running on the Loki network, which is similar to Tor for someone at home? Is that
yeah. So the Loki network is kind of like a set of incentivized nodes, which allows you to browse the internet anonymously and also access services inside LokiNet where the server doesn't know your IP address and you don't know the server's IP address. So it's kind of like the Mecca, like the ultimate anonymity protocol that you can kind of have. And this is very much related to the access bill that you were talking about. Like, you know, governments are just coming more and more into our lives, and not even governments as well. It's just private, private corporations now. We know how much data Facebook is collecting. And the idea behind LokiNet is that if we don't create that data in the first place, then there isn't this whole collection process going on. So that's kind of the goal, overarching goal of LokiNet.
In terms of transactions, you're saying bulletproofs, I think, reduced on Monero from like 60 cents to a cent or something crazy. But the Blink, is that your instant private transactions as well? That's nearly ready to go?
No, we haven't. We've done some preliminary research on the subject, but given that we're working on Loki Messenger as well now, and our issue is that we have like 2 or 3 developers who have the time and the capability of working on the core Loki stuff. The rest of our team is all focused on the LokiNet stuff and the Loki Messenger stuff. So, and that's also fairly resource intensive, and the domain specific knowledge required to work on those tasks is very, very different. So for the time being, Blink is sort of on a bit of a back burner because we know that, you know, the core of our mission is to provide this decentralized communications network for private messages and private access to the internet. So given that we're making really good progress on that, we're currently directing our resources towards those rather than Blink. But the research we have done on Blink seems entirely possible. It's just going to require a lot of legwork. So
I think Blink might actually happen sooner than you think. We had a couple of discussions about it, and it doesn't seem too difficult because we've already implemented a lot of the backbone for Blink. There's a couple of things on the Loki core side that we really want to introduce. So one is like infinite staking. Right now we have this staking protocol where you have to restake every 30 days. And that's kind of a bit of a UX issue. Like, we don't want people to be restaking every 30 days. It's kind of annoying. So we have infinite staking. Then we also have Blink. And then there's a couple of other things that we want to do on the core protocol. But yeah, we just got to prioritize those.
Because at the same time, we have to also continue to maintain our code base and fix any issues as they present themselves, and also keep an eye on what Monero is doing, because they often, obviously they've got a full team working on that as well, and we're able to borrow some of the better innovations that they create or improvements on the user experience. So we have spent a lot of time in the last couple of months trying to get up to speed with that. That's all now done, but you know, these things all take time, and as much as we would like to find talented C++ developers with an interest in blockchain specifically, it's really not that easy, and it's a constant. It's not really that much of a struggle, but it does take a lot of time as well.
So if you're a C++ developer, hit me up.
We've covered a lot then already today, guys, on what you're working on and what to look forward to. But anything else wrapping up, or tips for people that want to try and stay private or that are worried about what's going on?
The issue with this sort of bill, and we might start to see it in other countries as well, is that the way it's set up is that we just won't know when it gets used. It's set up in such a way that if companies are like trying to signal to their customers to, you know, be wary of this because something's going on here, we're being investigated, they can be sent to prison for up to 10 years, I think was the sentence. So we won't know if this bill is being used, and it could be being applied to overseas entities as well, where we have extradition treaties with certain nations. So it's entirely possible that a TCN that gets issued from Australia ends up getting an American charged with talking about this bill, and then they get extradited and put in prison here. So it's not really that clear how far-reaching this bill is going to be, but for the time being, if you are really nervous about this sort of thing, the best thing I can probably suggest is to stick to using open source software for the time being. There probably isn't a lot to worry about for the next month. Things should continue as normal, but beyond that, who really knows? And the only way to really know what you're using is to download the source of any software that you happen to want to use and build it yourself. That's probably the safest way to do it. But obviously, these days we're very reliant on closed-sourced or web-based applications like Google Drive or Telegram or WhatsApp or everything else, and we have absolutely no control over the software that is running inside those applications. So unfortunately, it's just going to be a case of being cautious about what you use when privacy matters to you, and at those times really think about long and hard about what you are going to use and where you're going to source your binaries from, because another attack that I don't think we quite mentioned was they could make us leave our source code as it is, but then when we go to build our binaries and release those for download, most people don't build it from source, but those that do, there could be extra code in that binary that's not in the source code that does something nefarious, and we wouldn't be able to tell anyone about it under this legislation. So there really is a merit to not just not downloading the trusted binaries, because that trusted binary is sort of being eroded away by this sort of thing. So getting an environment set up on your local machine and building it yourself is really the safest way to do it. But
we need more auditors too. Like, the more people that are auditing the source code, the easier it is for people to notice if something has been slipped in there maliciously as well. That wouldn't prevent that particular attack that you mentioned. But if people are building and then comparing with the binaries that have been released from a trusted source, and they find, oh, okay, well, it's actually exfiltrating some data to this server, which it's not doing in the open source version, well, then we can compare, and then we can work out, okay, well, maybe this version that the team released is not an official version really, and they've been corrupted. So, like, it's a very scary notion that the teams that you trust the most could be working against you and not be able to tell anyone because they're at risk of going to jail for 5 years.
That's probably a good place to finish, guys. But I appreciate that. You've given us all plenty to think about, and I'm sure we'll have to talk again in the future.
Well, I hope it all. I hope there's some amendments. Let's just say that.
Yeah. So do I. Yeah. Cool. Thanks for joining us today, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Cheers.